Hello, this is Richard from animate.com, and in this quick tutorial we are going to have a look at the add-on Erosion, and we are going to generate a sandy rocky desert like this one. So right off we are going to need a base mesh, a base landscape, which we are going to erode with the add-on. For this I'm going to add a plane, and with the modifiers I'm going to subdivide it simple 5 steps in the viewport to then apply it right away, because in edit mode we have now a lot of subdivisions. Either we are going to model it by hand in edit mode, but a little bit quicker is to simply use a noise texture, fractal texture, to generate a displaced landscape. So I add a displacement modifier and go to the texture which I generated. I'm going to define the type as clouds and scale it up to 1. So we would have a few rocks, and in order to get the sandy areas, the flat areas in between, we're going to use a color ramp. If I raise the black level, you already see a huge flat area here. We don't want to have it completely flat, so by pressing the Control key on my keyboard and clicking in the gradient, I'm generating a new dark gray area. So I have a lot of dark gray on the left side, and then the noise clouds will raise to the highest altitude. That's good, we're done. Now I would decimate once in order to get less squares, less rectangular squares, especially if I look from top, because that mesh topology will be the basis for erosion to be calculated. And the more irregularities there are, the more natural it will look. Let's apply these two modifiers, displacement and decimate, and do the same stuff again. I'm subdividing it maybe 3 times now. Let's have a look at the phase count. 40,000, yes, that's a good number. I think around 50,000 we're still very quick simulating the erosion. Add a second displacement modifier with a small noise texture this time. It's this time is much more about the details on the slopes and rocky walls. So we want to have, again, clouds, but very small ones. The size could be 0.05. We see a lot of small spikes. Yes, looks good, but the spikes are still far too big. Let's reduce it. Yeah, something like this. That's good. I think we're done. Maybe 0.03. And apply that one. So let's assume we're done. This is our base mesh. We want to erode this landscape. First off, if I look at it, I still recognize a lot of squares, and as I said earlier, we should decimate them into triangles and have much more irregularities. Not just triangulate that, because also a triangulation modifier would leave it very regular and very organized. The decimate is the right thing to get a more irregular and natural look. Now we are done. I couldn't come up with much more than we see now. So let's go to the tools panel, and in the animate area we have the Erosion add-on. We define our plane. Let's name it landscape. I'm setting 1 step because I just want to see how it will turn out. And yes, I want ridged parts in the at the rocky walls. I don't want to alter the topology. I don't need optimization or some level of detail for the camera position. So therefore I don't need to cap it. I don't want to simulate wind so that the erosion on one side would be stronger than on another side. No, we don't need that. And also these two options, selection, no, we are calculating all vertices and not just a single part. And border, no, we're going to even erode the border of our mesh. Maybe our landscape would be tileable, and like in a game we would have a lot of different tiles of landscape meshes. Then we want to preserve the border, the vertices at the border. Ridge, yes. Forest, we don't need particles to generate a forest. We don't need high quality modifiers. We want some vertex groups, some more. So let's erode. Should take about, well, it's 23,000 vertices, should take about 10 seconds, maybe 15 seconds. And I hope that the flat areas will be smooth. Here we are. Yes, they are smooth. And everything is smooth already. You see a smooth shading. But also the model changed the position of each vertex as if dirt would have run down. Let's just repeat it. Let's do it once more to get even more flat areas and bigger hills, wider wavelengths of this structure down here. Just let the dirt run down more. You see that here we get more detail, while here we get less detail. Stuff is gathering downhill, while uphill and in the slopes stuff runs down, and therefore graves canyons and rivers into the model. Okay, I'm happy with the mesh. I think the model is done. For a rocky desert we don't need much more detail than that. And now let's look at the shading. If we look at the rendered image, what do we see right away? Looks very artificial, like in a laboratory plastic table. First off, we got to change the lamp to sunlight, rotate it a little to get some harsh shadow casting on our landscape, some higher contrast. Then we can add some background sky texture. I'm in Eevee, so I won't see the sky texture. It's not implemented into Eevee. I don't know if ever, but of course we're going to change the cycles in order to get all the nodes we want. And in this area up here I can load the shader editor and add, I have the landscape selected, add a material to the landscape. This is the point where we want to map our mesh. You see that there is an erosion button and a map button. Let's just hit the map button and wait for the maps to be calculated. They're going, this map button is generating UV maps. Why does it do that? First off, you can use some simple gradient images, two-dimensional gradients, to use directly with the map. And let's have a look at one of these maps that it generated. We have, for example, flow and gather, which means where does stuff flow down. If a vertex has a strong flow down, then its U coordinate will be very high. If a vertex has a lot of dirt gathered, like we have here in the flat areas down where a lot of sand will be, then the V coordinate of that map will be very high, of that vertex will be very high. So right away you can figure that separating these coordinates with a separate XYZ node will be very helpful. Let's just have a look, maybe without the shadow, so I will plug it into emission to see how that looks, and ignore the color by making it black. Copy that. There we are. So what do we see with the flow? Let's just check all the maps. It's like the vertex groups, the weights of the vertex groups we had before. Here's the gather. Maybe let's duplicate that, because we're gonna need some more than just one UV map. Here we have length and wide flow and run and river. I will cycle through it quite quickly in order to save some time in the tutorial. You see how long the flows are and how wide they were if they diffuse left and right. And here we have the thin rivers. Here's the stuff running down, and this is yes, this is the rivers that will be generated. So these structures, these masks, can be used in the shading. It's not that some geometry would be generated when there is a river calculated. It's much more like you have a mask where you can color your landscape according to where rivers would be and where dirt would run down. So how do we color it now? We can use the rivers to make the slopes, the steep places or rocky walls. We could also use them to make some color variation down in the sandy hills. But first off, we have to divide the rocky sidewalls from the sandy flat areas. And for this, the flow gather would be very helpful. Let's have a look with a color ramp. So if I raise the flow level, the lower part of the flow, not much stuff is flowing in the flat area, while there's more stuff flowing down in the steep areas. And the same goes for the gathering. A lot of stuff is gathering in the slope, in the flat areas, while not so much in the rocky walls. That's good to get some irregular shapes. And what I like and use very often is to subtract the flow from the gathering. And then already some sort, or maybe the other way around, subtract the gather from the flow. Then already a very complex structure is resulting. You see something very much more detailed than each single component. But apart from that, the best way to divide the flat area from the steep areas would be to use the map set normal and height. See, set normal. This will right away give us like a snowfall, snow coming from top, staying in that area. Well, maybe it's not the best impression to make sand which ran down, but for a start we can use the set normal here and combine it together with another map. Let's not subtract these two, but let's use the flow, the set normal, and maybe add the flow like that. Of course, we have to adjust the color ramp. And yes, there comes definitely the first black areas will be only in the steep areas, which is what we want. But I cannot control the rest of it because I already bump into the right edge of my color ramp, so I'm going to multiply it by 0.5 in order to lower all the factors that come in by half, and so I can control the area better, or color the area better, which I want to color. So this would be my mask between sand and stone and rocks, okay? Black rocks, white sand. Right away we can add a color mix. To me it's crucial that in a color ramp I'm just using black and white, and if I want to color it I'm using a color mix just to keep, you know, there will be a bunch of nodes, just to have an overview. If you color these already, then you can just use them for one property, which is the color, for example. You couldn't use them for metallic or roughness because it won't be a mask, it will already be the color. So I'm separating the color itself into a separate mesh. Black would be color 1, that's the rocky part. Let's make some dark red, reddish brown rock. And sand will be orange, like a gray orange. This one here, no, much more yellowish and brighter. Yeah, more gray, like that. Additionally, I want to see some rivers on the steep parts, so I would add the rivers to that mask also. Because if I just add it, I'm going to get into the white area. And where do we have the rivers? Down here. Let's move that away and get that up here. Rivers is the Y component, it's the second, the V part of our UV map, and in the vector it's the Y component. Let's just add it here. And we see that the slopes already have big rivers. Not the slopes, the steep rocky walls already have big rivers. And in order to get some less, either we're going to raise the black level, but then we will get some rocky parts in the flatland or also, which I don't like that much. However, what we also could do is either use a color ramp in between here, or just give it an exponent, something like 2. So square the map itself, the mask itself, and then you already have much thinner rivers on the walls. And we can lower the black level again. But that's a very mathematical approach, and maybe it's more intuitive to just use a color ramp in between here. So, however, that's just a mask between rocky walls and sand. Another thing we want to have is, of course, some more color variation within the rocky walls. Let's head and let's look at that. So where there's one brown color, we want another mix of 2 colors in the rocky wall area. The rocky walls would mainly be driven by sedimentation and dirt flowing down. So either I use, what did we use here? The X component. Now I could use the Y component, which is the gathering of dirt. And you see here is a dark area and the bright area. Of course we can color that so it doesn't have the same color as the sand. But that's not enough variation right away. We can modify it like we did with the river here with power and stuff. But let's see if we get a better map out of the others. Sediment, this is one I'm looking at. Yes, there's already much more variation in the color we're seeing here, and the glossiness of the material is taking too much noise. So I want this one to be the color variation of my rocky wall, maybe just vary between a grayish and a brownish color. Let's get darker here. Okay, let's assume that's good. Maybe a little bit more color in this one, like that. Pretty far already, and we're 20 minutes into the tutorial. I think I will have to quickly wrap it up now. So what else? The bump, of course. The bump will be the next complex thing. Before that, quickly, let's get some variation in the sand. Let's take this as a bright color and this as a dark color, maybe a little bit brighter than the rock, and that one could be more saturated, therefore. That's our sand, and we want to use the rivers as our variation. Do we need the power, the exponent rivers, or just the rivers itself? I don't know. Let's figure it out. I think that's okay. That's enough already. Like that. Maybe you could add some other masks, like we did up here. Here we added two different components of different maps. We could do the same here for the factor. But let's keep it simple and quick. Much more crucial will be the shading due to the normal, due to the bump map. So this is how it looks like right away with our bright sunlight. I think that's much too high. Yes, we just need factor of 10 for sunlight. You see that it's not over. There are no highlights now. And we want some sort of bump map, so we can add already the bump node itself. We will take use of the mask, because the rocky walls will have a different bump than the sand, and therefore we need two different textures, one for the sand and one for the rock. Both will be a noise texture. I'll make it 8 steps of detail, and if I just plug it in without mask, I can judge the size of my texture, and I should add a good vector space for that one. Let's just use the object vector coordinates, the object space for this texture. Then the noise texture will have a good proportion, or it won't be stretched in one way. So now I can adjust the size of my noise for the rocky walls. This is my rocky wall texture, and I can look at the small wrinkles that appear with the bump map, and use a second one for the grain of the sand. Now, of course, sand is very, very, very small, but first maybe it's more important to do some wavy texture into the sand, so that it's sand dunes. Let's raise the sunlight so that we see more of the sand texture. Yeah, it's very bumpy because of the rock bump, so we have to do the same thing here. One noise with this mask. The white parts, the black parts are the rocky walls, the white parts are the sand, and right away we see flat sand. It's flat again, and bumpy rocks. And for the flat part, I said I want to have some wavy texture for the sand hills. These don't have detail. We won't raise above 2 in the detail for these. We want maybe, yeah, the structure could be much smaller than for the rocks, of course. So this can be 150, for example. See very, very, very small sand hills. And now we want to get some regularity. And this is a special trick. Before that, let's vary the strength, because the rocks need much more strength in the bump than the snowy part. Maybe let's do a gradient of its own for that. Converter, color ramp. We use the same factor as the mask. We just use different colors to control the strength. So let's have a look at where the black level is. Position 0. No, that's the white. 0.44 and 0.72. That will be precise enough. And 0.72. And now we want to have here the rocky part strength, which is full strength, full white, and just a fraction of that, not black, but dark gray, just a fraction of that for the sand. So the sand hills are just this height. One sand hill is just as high compared to one rock reaching out of the wall. Plug that into the strength of our bump, and we see it's not enough. We want much more. So let's multiply it with a math node set to multiplication. This one multiplied by 5, for example. Yeah, still don't see much of the sand. Maybe the sand must be raised. Yeah, now it appears. And I want to get rid of the peaks of these spikes here, where the rocky bump map appears. Maybe I will just do that by lowering the strength factor, which is very convenient because now we don't change the mask for the rocky walls. We just change the mixture of bump maps. So, yes, and some regularity, because these look very fractal, very generated, synthetic, not very natural. There was no wind blowing on them and stuff like that. I want some more sandy feel to this shading. And why don't we use the wave texture for that? I'm going to plug it into the object vector space and use the factor of the wave texture as distortion for our sand noise texture. So in waves, our sand hills will be distorted. If we raise the scale, we will see narrow rows of distortions. It will align already. Let's raise it to 150, and there you see how these build like the wind would blow in one direction, which would be about that direction up here, and therefore or maybe along the graves. Yeah, it's much more logical if the wind is blowing that direction, of course. However, this looks much more natural, much more blown than a moon desert would look like, where there is no wind because of no atmosphere, and stuff is just falling down and will never make a short step. And I think we're done. That's it. I wouldn't add much more detail. Maybe in the rocks here you maybe want to have more color variation. We can use we can take advantage of the bump texture itself. For example, we could exaggerate the mix factor of the rock texture or of the rock colors, again with math node, and use the factor for example, as power. And then you would introduce the noise texture for the bump of the rocks into the coloring. We could also multiply it, for example. So any operation, mathematical operation, which will keep the factor between 0 and 1 will help us to add more detail. And a noise texture of 11 is very, very high, very big. Let's raise it to smaller details. Let's look at 50, and we already see that there is a little bit more color variation now. Maybe 100. Yes, that looks much better. And you see some black spots. That's because we have exaggerated the strength of our bump map. It should be capped with 1. If you have the highest strength of 1, then you won't see those black caps. If you use a higher strength, it would mean that the shading point is facing away from the camera, away from us, and that's something you couldn't calculate in the render engine with light shading. So basically that's the reason why there's black spots appearing. So I would lower the strength of the bump now. Okay, last point, atmosphere. This is pretty standard and has nothing to do with the add-on, so I'm cycling through very quickly. I added box, I scale it up, I scale it just in X and Y to make it much more wider and deeper than high, and add a principled volume shader. Plug it into the volume, plug out the surface. We see a lot of fog. No, didn't want to delete the box, I wanted to delete the surface shader. So let's add some pale white and lower the density to 0.01. Okay. It's some thick atmosphere. There are two different parts where we could make a better landscape. First, we could use something like just half of the density, but what I really love to use is a set gradient, a gradient along the Z axis, so that in lower parts there's more density, more atmosphere than up at the peaks, and it really adds to the natural feel of the scene. If it's not that homogeneous, everything looks the same in the fog density, in the atmosphere. So how would we achieve that? I just add a geometry node, ask for the position of the shading point, which is in volume, or maybe not just the position, we could also just use texture coordinate, object coordinate, and separate that so that we get the Z axis. Here we go. It's partly negative and partly positive, since the box we generated, the cube, has its origin in the middle, in the center of the geometry. So there is vertices below the origin point. But in order to get positive values between around 0 and 0.005, we will have to add this interval from -1 to +1. We add 1, so we get an interval from 0 to 2. Then we divide it. Either we multiply it by 0.5, so it's an interval between 0 and 1. We just divide it by 2, that's the same. And last thing, to get a gradient. So this right away would look like that, much too dense. Then, of course, we could multiply it with the according density we want to have, which was 0.05, or was it 2 O's? Let's have a look. Yeah, 2 O's, or zeros. So, and maybe let's double that, because this is now the maximum density which we see, and it's every other altitude will have a lower density than that. So, okay, that's too much. Let's just double it here, like this, even more, like this. Yeah, because now we see the direction of the gradient. The peaks are in a dense high fog, while the flatland down in this at the sand level is quite undense. We want it the other way around, and one way I like to do that is to divide it. So if I have 0 down here and 1 up here, I could use the inverse with a division, and then I get a very high number here, because 1 over 0 is a very, very high number, and I get a very low number up here at the 1 level. That would be one way. And of course another one is just to use a simple gradient, which we define as curve. I think that's the most intuitive. And we do that between the divide thing, where we have an interval of 0 to 1, and the multiply, which transforms that interval into 0 until 0.05. In between here, we want to adjust the gradient in what direction it should turn. So I think the intuitive way would be to use RGB curves, plug it in here, and make a fall off. Just model manually a fall off curve that looks like that. Here is the peak level, that's uphill, that's down at the sand level. And here we define how the density will decrease. Doesn't look like, to me, doesn't look like what I said is actually happening. Trying to get the limits into the landscape. Up here it's almost 0, so we won't see that there is a border, but you get the idea. It should be as close as possible to everything. And here on that part you already see that in the lower end there is much more density than in the upper end. That's what we did here with the fall off. And let's have a look if higher values will help us to see what we're trying to achieve. Yes, this looks natural, very natural. And also, something I like about the Erosion Addon, it looks really much more natural than World Machine or other erosion algorithms that just make a two-dimensional solution of erosion. They look brilliant in some sort, but they don't look natural. You can, even a layman would point out precisely what's coming out of World Machine or what's a real natural erosion of a landscape. Like here, I don't have the feeling that this is calculated strictly on where this part has the exact same algorithm as this part. It looks different. It has different shapes. Of course, overall the idea of the landscape is the same. The style of the landscape is the same, but there is no regular fractal-looking patterns on that. While most of the images we see from World Machine and other erosion simulators, there very quickly, but for the sake of natural impression. You see a very, very, very synthesized look of erosion. It looks very geometrical, like coming out of a laboratory, where the landscape was 3D printed over weeks. So in a very precise and yeah, to me it just looks artificial, like an artificial landscape. And this one looks like a real, not a realistic, not a photorealistic landscape. Of course, we would need much more detail, much more background and stuff like that, and maybe rivers and plants and stuff. But the way things run down and the way the rocky parts turn into flatland, it feels much more natural than with a purely two-dimensional height map erosion simulation. So, still unhappy with the atmosphere. I will exaggerate the fall-off curve into something like this. So it's very dense in the lower part. That's the lower part here. It's very dense, it's very high, and it quickly loses density as the height rises. We now see that this part here is also has almost no atmosphere. So maybe we should lower E all the points down there, because I like it. Okay, but that's the part number 3. So first we made the base mesh and then eroded the base mesh. We checked that the parameters are the ones we want. We don't want to alter our mesh, so we didn't use optimize. Let's just pause it because I don't want the lag. Let's pause it here. We don't need the optimize, so we don't need to cap the vertex count. The vertex count will stay the same as long as we don't hit these two. The topology will stay the same. The only thing the erosion will make is to move vertices up and down if we have not checked anything here. So the topology will be preserved. We want to have ridged parts so that very steep areas like this one here may move vertices right down to the level of its neighbor, of its lower or lowest neighbor. It will completely move down there. That's like a stuff is breaking off and falling down as a heavy rock. That's the ridged parameter. The forest is just generating forests, create forest particles. Please have a read with all these poetry I was writing in here. Optimize mesh, changing topology. Chemtrack means optimize regarding chemtrack. So every parameter has an explanation in the mouse over. And this should be the quickest way to explain to you what does. Here the high quality is just adding subdivision and displacement to have more detail in the mesh than just the base mesh. Erode this higher detail landscape and then decimate it again to a lower density landscape as the erosion simulation ends. And the vertex groups are these fellas here, where for each erosion step you will get a new set of vertex groups. Here we see that's from the second step of erosion I took, and as far as I know, these 3, yeah, they come with a map. If you hit map and have vertex groups checked, then the flow gather and the diverge vertex groups will be added. Otherwise, they will just be available as UV maps. The UV maps will be generated when you hit map. And these are the ones we used in the shading. So mapping your landscape is crucial to get access to all these gradients. You can't access vertex groups or weight paints in the shading. You can access them the same parameters, the same gradients here down in the UV maps by separating the components and using them as mix factor, for example, or any way you like. So that's basically how I achieve, how I would approach a rocky desert sand, a rocky sand desert. I hope you enjoyed the tutorial, and if you have questions, just ask them right downwards in the comment section of YouTube, or hit me a message on blendermarket.com. Of course, check out my other products on Blender Market. Most of them use heavy math. I studied physics. I know a lot of math which I apply to Blender and Python, and I think there is some gems there which might improve your workflows and just make your life happier, because stuff like this can be calculated with Python, and maybe something of that I did already. So see you next time with the next tutorial, and please feel free to get me feedback. I get very few feedback from users, and mainly they're very polite and happy that I helped them and that I made something, but actually I need to improve my product. So just tell me what should be done better, and where things are not as obvious or easy to understand. Even this, they don't have to be, my products don't have to be super complex and genuine and highly advanced. It's already an improvement if the product is being easier understood and easier to use. So I think that's all for now, and then I'm switching off. I hope you have a nice day, and see you next time. Bye bye.